without further ado, welcome to Session 5 in the Sargent Shriver Program for Public Service Leadership. These Shriver case study seminars are now in their 5th installment. Today's session is called Selling the Peace Corps, Shriver as Pitchman for Peace. And we are really looking at the efforts that were undertaken in the middle part of 1961 to appeal to 3 different constituencies, to take this new idea, this idea that had been initially proposed by President Kennedy. He had tapped Sargent Shriver to lead and implement, to 3 constituencies. Constituency number 1, to Congress, to convince those on Capitol Hill that they should sign off on this program, period, and specifically the designs that Sargent Shriver and the task force of which Bill was a part had created for it. Number 2, the host countries. You have to go around the world and see if anybody would actually want to take these volunteers, and what are the barriers to that. So we're going to explore that. And 3, the volunteers themselves. You need people, Americans, young Americans, to want to sign up and be a part of this nascent organization, and to do so not only in numbers, but with the right kind of spirit and approach and attitude to make this program a long-term success. And competence. And competence, absolutely. So we thought we would start with that latter group. That is the group that's really, in 1961, your peers. You know, college students, recent graduates, those who are thinking about life after the university were a key target audience. And what I thought we might do is jump in with a PSA here in 1 second. But Bill, I'm curious to know from your perspective, what thinking behind the scenes on the part of the task force was going into the recruitment effort right now? What was the driving force for the recruitment effort?
The most important development was, of course, the acquisition of Bill Moyers from Lyndon Johnson's staff. Bill had made it clear to me from the get-go that he wanted to serve in the Peace Corps. Johnson understood this. Shriver, of course, was delighted. And Bill became head of recruitment, although he also very quickly took on the congressional portfolio as well. So Bill was principally responsible for the Peace Corps' outreach, both to potential volunteers, and don't leave out, incidentally, older people.
Yes.
Because there were a lot of older people in the early Peace Corps, and there still are some.
Still are today, yeah.
And to Congress, of course.
And so what were the strategies and methods that were employed early on to try and recruit those volunteers?
Well, we all were recruiters. The staff fanned out over the country to colleges, to universities, to private agencies. You know, we set up booths. We recruited volunteers the way employers recruit prospective employees. It was a massive staff recruitment effort. We also got very free and wonderful advertising from the Advertising Council, which was a nonprofit of all the advertising agencies that took on good causes, and they took us on, and they created a series of quite wonderful ads. I don't know whether you're going to show any of the ads. Are you?
We are, in fact.
You are, okay, good.
We have one here. Why don't we start with a very, very early public service announcement. And they get, I think, increasingly interesting and provocative as we go forward.
The willingness of all Americans to serve in the Peace Corps is one of the most encouraging manifestations of American spirit that this country has seen. The Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged. Our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help. They are serving this country well, and they are serving a larger cause, the cause of freedom and the cause of a peaceful world. They are demonstrating their interest in people who may live on the other side of the globe, who may live in poverty and misery, but who, because of the presence of the Peace Corps, live in hope. There can be no greater service to our country, and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States.
All right, so that's one of the early messages. Let's play a second one, and we'll talk about the strategies employed here and the difference between them. This is a second one, also of a similar vintage.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bob joining the Peace Corps Hope. No, this isn't one of my road pictures. It's another production, The Road to Peace. And you could be one of the stars. All you need is energy and willingness and guts. In a couple of years, you'd like to donate to history. Most of it's on location in places like Chile, Tanganyika, or Malaya. And the script might be in Swahili or Hindustani. The motels aren't so hot, but the pay is great, 11 cents an hour. But it's not all giving, there's a lot of getting, too. All the satisfaction of helping people who really want it. The excitement of watching your 16 hours a day plow ruts of poverty, sickness, and ignorance into the biggest road picture of them all. It's hard work if you can get it. And if you want to try, write the Peace Corps, Washington, D.C.
So those were two early ads. What strikes you about the messaging? What are the points that they're trying to underscore here?
They really weren't ashamed to admit that it was a lot of hard work and that it might not have been like the most pleasant experience physically, but it was going to be rewarding. So I think that really could have appealed to a lot of people, and that they could actually make a difference to the hard work.
Hard work, rewarding, make a difference. What else? Yeah.
It almost seems like it's like posing a challenge to the individuals, and like in the sense that like, can you do this? Are you capable of doing this? And like incentivizing them to take on that challenge.
Yeah.
That's a very important point, because one of the things we discovered in evaluation of the selection process was that self-selection and motivation and the willingness to suffer were extremely important predictors of success in the Peace Corps.
And that was something that Sarge was very attuned to. In June, I believe, of 1961, he makes a speech here in Chicago.
Well, he does.
At DePaul University. And we have excerpts of that.
Yeah, we have
go to the
that.
commencement address. Let's actually turn to that. That's this document here, for those of you who are playing along around the table. Talk to us about it. Page 2 is, I think, the page.
Maybe we could.
That's right. Are we missing a key page?
Well, I think we may be
You know
missing
what?
a page.
I think we may be missing actually the key page in the copy. Hold on one second.
Do you have
I'll get it for you.
Is this it?
You can set it up while I find the document if you don't mind.
Make another comment?
Please.
I think we're missing.
One
a
of
page.
the important factors actually was free media. The Peace Corps was a story. It was a story in the United States. It was a story overseas. So we had an incredible amount of free media. Indeed, Ray Shearer, who was a very, very important NBC correspondent, did a beautiful documentary of the surveying project in Tanzania. Then it was Tanganyika. I don't know whether you have any excerpts from that film, but it's a great film.
We don't, but it was a savvy use of multimedia, of propaganda, of PSAs, of speeches, of films, all those kinds of things. I want to come back and talk about some of the other PSAs for a second, but this idea of whether you are tough enough is something that Sarge speaks to. So we printed off copies of the speech, and in the double-sided world, the actual most important page was left out of this trio here, so forgive us. So, Jamie, you've got it in front of you from my original document here.
Maybe we could.
Do you mind sharing a little bit, reading a bit of it?
No, and could I take 1 second to just to sort of check in on everybody's names, so
Sure.
since we're small enough. Do you mind going around and just saying who you are? I'm Jamie Price.
Okay, I'm Aya.
And tell us what year you are.
I'm first year.
First year, great.
Hi, I'm Paola. I'm a fourth year technically.
Great.
Yeah, I'm Calvin. I'm a first year.
I'm Adalia. I'm a fourth year.
I'm Nico. I'm a third year.
I'm George. I'm a second year. I'm Daniel. I'm a first year.
I'm Hojo. I'm a second year.
I'm Elsa Metcalfe from the Chicago Booth, MBA, second year.
Great.
And I'm Karen. I'm not a student. I'm a member of the community, but I was the target audience that this was going to in the mid to late 60s when I was in college and university.
Great, great. You may see some messages you recognize then.
I'm a third year.
Yes.
I'm Jean. I applied and was accepted to the Peace Corps in 1966.
And served.
And graduated. No, I didn't. My husband was a graduate student, and he was afraid if we went to Tehran he would never finish his PhD.
Well, I'm glad you're
It's
here.
obviously before the child was exposed.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
My name's Akash, and I'm also first year.
Great, great. So let's talk a little bit about this. What was Sarge hearing, and what was his about this question? What was he doing on the DePaul University address?
Well, can we? You okay with?
Sure, we can pass around, yeah.
Yeah. Just to hear it from these first 5 paragraphs. If you don't feel like reading, just pass it on to the next. But you just take the first paragraph.
Sure. Americans are not alone, however, in doubting the intellectual and spiritual fiber of modern America. I encountered these doubts all around the world on my recent trip. Yours was the first revolution. I was told in India by Asha Devi, a vigorous woman associated with Mahatma Gandhi. Do you think you Americans possess the spiritual values they must have to bring the spirit of the revolution to our country? Your Peace Corps must catch the idealism of America and bring that to us. Can you do it?
Can you do it? It's a rhetorical question. He's asking the audience. Are you up to it? Yeah.
She put that question to me, and I pass it on to you. To those of you who may be saying, as college graduates often do, I can't think of anything to do. Let me tell you that a world is waiting for you, and there is plenty to do. I came back from this trip with requests for more than 4,000 Americans to work in just the 8 nations I visited. I'm convinced that 50,000 jobs need filling, and they need filling now, in the 103 underdeveloped areas of the world. One after another, the leaders of Africa and Asia not only welcomed the idea of the Peace Corps, but they requested Peace Corps volunteers to serve in their countries.
From a different culture, they will be performing important work for another country. They'll be serving their own country and the cause of freedom above all. They will be proving that Americans are ready to join hands with other people in a serious pursuit of peace. The demand is there for every kind of talent, skill, or profession. Now the question is, what of the supply? Are there enough qualified Americans available and willing to spend 2 years in a tough assignment abroad? Keep on.
You can finish down at the bottom.
Yeah.
Mr. Khrushchev says no. Only the other day he branded American young people as dissipated good-for-nothings. I think he will eat those words when
That was
he
a
learns-
quote, by the way, I think, right? Dissipated
Yeah.
good-for-nothings.
Dissipated good-for-nothings. I think he will eat those words when he learns that response to the Peace Corps is already proving that Americans of diverse training and abilities are stepping forward in large numbers to say, quote, you can count on us.
That may be the.
Almost 4,000 Americans of all ages took the first battery of Peace Corps examinations last week. Despite the fact that the tests were given during final examination periods on many college and university campuses, and despite the fact that our tests are purely voluntary. What kind of response would a professor at DePaul get if he announced, "We're going to have an exam Saturday. You're invited to take it if you want to"?
That's good. I think that'll handle it. Thank you.
So what strikes you about that, Jamie? Help contextualize this.
Well, what strikes me about this is, I mean, not only is Sarge, as Bill said, not only was he taking it on the road and giving this as a commencement address here in Chicago to DePaul University, but it was a reflection, I mean, historically, in terms of everything that he'd heard. As he said, he went to 8 nations, and all of them said, this sounds wonderful, this Peace Corps thing, but we don't really know if Americans can do it. We don't really know if older Americans or younger Americans really have the grit and the staying power and the commitment to come and live with us and do this. In his more detailed report, he talked about there were a number of countries, number of people who said, I don't think the volunteers ought to live in the villages because they're just going to get sick and they're going to get hot and then they won't be of any use to us at all. So there was a whole lot of doubt on that part. So he came back and his selling point was basically, do you have it? And that kind of challenge. I guess what I'm interested in is you know, how does that land? I mean, imaginatively, how does that land on you, or what would that have been? What would that have been like for you, or what would that be like now, to hear you're dissipated good for nothing? We really don't think you can do this. Do you have
to go to a country that you've never been in,
Yep.
where the living standards are demonstrably lower,
Right.
where your pay is going to be 11 cents an hour, or
That's
whatever
right.
the equivalent is in today's dollar.
That's right.
A language you don't speak, and to do service among a community that may not be all that excited to see you.
Well, you have to make them excited to see you.
Right.
That's
but,
right.
But
they
upon
wouldn't.
arrival.
Upon arrival.
Yeah.
Upon arrival. And to do it in service to your country, because this is going to be one of the most, Sarge would claim, we've been exploring this, one of the most effective, perhaps the most effective response to the problem of peace and the Cold War that there is. So can you put yourself on the line for your country, for the world, for peace, for other people, and take 2 years out of your life to do this?
I'm curious to know what made you apply. What made you
Exactly.
answer that question?
Where did she serve and what made her apply?
Well, it was exactly the challenge. Wanting to do good, wanting to have a sort of a counterbalance to the war.
The escalating war in Vietnam.
Yeah. And I thought it would be exciting to learn a new language and a different part of the world.
Yeah.
So it was going to be an adventure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to this day that we didn't do it.
I also think
It's not too late.
For me it is.
Well, but,
Not in principle.
okay, it was an adventure, but from your point of view, did you feel you accomplished anything?
Well, I don't know if you heard, Bill, she didn't go.
I didn't go.
Oh, you didn't go?
Because my husband was nixed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, just to set the context for those of you who are new here, 1961, Bay of Pigs happens in the spring of that year, height of the Cold War. We are 16 years after the end of World War II. We are really 30 years, barely, after the end of World War I. So we're just 10 years after the midpoint of the century, and we've had 2 major world wars. We are at the height of the Cold War. Khrushchev, Castro, Cuban Missile Crisis is still a year and a half away, but Bay of Pigs is happening. There's a fight around the globe in a proxy war to see where are you going to be aligned as a nation. You're familiar with this history. So the idea, this is for the benefit of those of you who are new, that you would create a core of Americans willing to volunteer internationally in countries all across the globe for the cause of peace was a radical idea at the time. And in the 1960 presidential campaign, when Kennedy first announces this, he's met with great enthusiasm on the part of many college students across campus. But they don't know what the idea is. Kennedy doesn't even know what the program is. He just says notionally this idea that we might be able to enlist you to go around the world to help people to build deeper relationships, to improve the lives of others in service of the greater humanitarian benefit, not in service of a particular policy objective, although it clearly would benefit the United States and its image abroad, but in a spirit of goodwill and friendship. That is sort of the proposition that's before us. And what we've done over the past 3 sessions is really talk about how you take the kernel of this idea and make it a reality. So now we're at the point where you're out saying the program is real. Here's what it looks like. Are you in? Some of you said you might be in, but are you really in? Here's what it takes. And who are they looking for? What's the kind of volunteer that's ideal?
Well, obviously, I mean, the kind of, there are 2 things. The kind of volunteer that's ideal is, as Sarge says here, and is somebody who's willing to suffer, to be humble about what their needs are, who is somebody who's potentially curious about other people, somebody who's willing to learn another language, somebody who's willing to live at the level of the people they're trying to help, somebody who's willing to ask what somebody needs rather than, and to live in that ambiguity where you don't know if you're being effective or not. You don't know if you're really helping or not. You're just making yourself available and staying in that kind of openness until it becomes clear. And
yeah, a lot of people think the Peace Corps is about the Americans taking their ideas into a particular community. And I think it's really important that it's not, I'm here to help provide something to you that I think you would need, and instead coming with a sense of openness to say, I'm not sure how I can be useful, but
right.
I'm here if I can. Let's figure that out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, exactly. What Sarge was clear about, and we talked about this when we talked about his method. I mean, he knew that there were two things required for making peace. One was that if you weren't being peaceful, if you were in conflict, that there was some threat that you were deciding to defend. And so people's conflict behavior was a function of that, feeling threatened and protecting. So how do you unlock those things? How do you de-link those things? So people were threatened and protecting against the Soviet Union, but against the United States, and really pretty righteous and certain about that. How do you open that up? And his broadly philosophical and spiritual approach to that was to say, well, the only way you can really do it is to have enough compassion for the other person that you can be curious about them in their own terms and then serve their needs. Those are kind of broad terms, compassion and service, and the way he actualized them was just in the ways we said, to go over, learn the language, make yourself available. And his view was that if you do that, I mean, he really, this is where his Catholic faith and his kind of spiritual center came into things. He really felt that if there's going to be genuine peace across those kinds of boundaries, human beings aren't so good at doing it. We need help. And in his view, help came from the deeper heart of compassion that moves in the world, and that he felt was at the heart of all religious traditions and at the heart of all people, whether you have a religious tradition or not. And so he didn't care whether somebody was secular or atheist or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist. What he cared was, are you able to be acting in such a way that you can manifest compassion and offer yourself to serve? And if you are, that aligns you somehow with the normative flow of the cosmos, with the way the world is going, and toward peace. And that's how you make friends. And so he was enormously trusting about that. And it's almost like he set this program up to create an opportunity for that to move, to cooperate with that, with that structure. He didn't go and talk about it that way. He found that there was broadly in the developing world a need for skills, a need for middle-level management, a need for nurses, a need for surveyors, a need for tractor mechanics, and that the U.S. could supply those. And so that was the hook, but the focus was, how do you supply that? And you do that with humility, and you do that in ways that will make friends, that will cross those boundaries. And he thought he could transform the planet that way.
Yeah. I want to direct your attention to another document. The top of this document says subject Peace Corps volunteer personnel policies. And if you can turn to the second page, it actually enumerates many of the qualities that Jamie is talking about here. If you start with obligations and duties of the Peace Corps, let's go around and just read these one at a time. Akash, can we begin with you? Point A.
Serve in a volunteer capacity for a specified tour of duty.
Okay, so saying, hey, you agree to the full time here. Yeah.
Except the need for subordinating his personal preferences or an independent course of action to the requirements of the Peace Corps.
Yeah. So this is truly about service, not about you. You want to continue?
C, undertake such area, language, or other training as the Peace Corps determines is necessary to ensure maximum effectiveness on his assignment.
Right, so you're committing to the training to make sure that you can be effective when you go into country. Yeah.
D, perform willingly and to the best of his ability under supervision of host country nationals or other persons designated by the Peace Corps such duties as may be required of him.
So this is basic stuff around commitment, right? All right, continue on with point E.
E, accept transfer from one post or duty station to another if such transfers are determined to be in the interest of the individual, the project, or the Peace Corps.
Okay, circumstances can change, needs can change. We need to make sure that you are in for whatever you're asked to do. Yeah.
Occupy such living accommodations as may be provided both in the United States and abroad.
Right. And as we've alluded to in this session already, in past sessions, those living, and as you know from the first session with former Peace Corps volunteer Kirby Jones, those accommodations were exceedingly modest in those cases. Yeah, George.
G. Travel via routes, conveyances, and accommodation designated with when moving from one assignment to another, remaining in duty status while in transit.
Yeah, so this isn't go gallivanting around the world and just taking lots of time on leave or showboating or freeloading or freelancing. You're here to work. Yeah.
Comply explicitly and diligently with prescribed health, sanitary, and safety regulations.
Okay, so this is all basic stuff. Yeah. Now we're getting into some different things here. Continue on with I, if you would.
I show respect for local customs, manners, taboos, religions, and traditions.
Maintain standards of personal conduct, whether on or off duty, which will reflect credit on the Peace Corps.
K, maintain the required standards of personal appearance and grooming.
L, take an appropriate part in the community and civic life of the area to which he is assigned.
M, recognize his ability to live within the allowance provided for him.
All right, I want to stop there. I, J, K, L, M, N. Personal appearance and grooming, take appropriate part in community and civic life, live within the means provided, meaning you're not getting additional infusions of cash from outside work or for mom and dad back home or whatever source of money you might be able to provide. Show respect for local customs, manners, taboos, religions, and traditions. Maintain standards of personal conduct. Why is it important to enumerate these things? What's he trying to inculcate among the volunteers here? Yeah.
I think this goes to the point of being ambassadors for the United States, exemplifying, like a model citizen in that sense. I think they are trying to give a good image to the United States. So of course, they should have a good image and be willing to get along well wherever they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, it's like a sense that they're part of something bigger than themselves. Like they're part of this whole core of people, and in a sense, their actions reflect on the core. So they must if you create this list of I guess obligations and duties, sort of like a reflection of what the core should be as a whole.
Yeah.
So you should follow that.
Yeah. Other thoughts that strike you? I mean, it's yes.
It's throwing away your sense of privilege that we have here, and being willing to do whatever is needed wherever we go.
And strategically, I think because there would be, you come into a village, or you come into a situation, or you come into a town, and people would maybe be curious about you, but they would also have ideas about what an American is. And they'd probably be wrong about that, certainly be wrong about what the Peace Corps is. It would likely be suspicious, or for many people it would be suspicious. And how do you need to be so that there's an opportunity to be curious about you? I mean, not only does doing these things position you to be curious and understand the other person, but all the projections that somebody would have on a foreigner, and this strange representative of the U.S. government who's now in my village, and why, and what are you doing, and
well, I think, Amy, that it's wrong, if I may say so, to say this strange representative of the U.S. government. Every one of these was designed to unrelate volunteers to the United States government.
Well, that's what I mean by strange. I mean, and they wouldn't know that they were unrelated until they operated in this way.
Well, they might actually know that they were unrelated.
The people in the community?
Yes.
Well, maybe they would. Maybe they would. But if they didn't, the possibility, my contention would be that the possibility for having a preconceived negative notion of the U.S. stick is less likely if you're behaving this way than otherwise.
But I think we need to address the fact that other Americans, whether they're in the diplomatic corps, whether they're in AID, whether they're in the military, whether they're tourists, don't behave in this way. This is designed to actually totally depart from the way anyone who might have come into contact with Americans in any of the roles that I just described is different, is not only different, but radically different. Mm-hmm. You know, the key to me always has been show respect. I think respect might be a term that we add to compassion and service. Respect.
Respect, compassion, and service. And one thing I just want to point out here for the purpose of the program as a whole and for the Shriver Fellowships, which will commence in winter quarter and spring, is that we're using the Peace Corps as a case study to unearth some of these core enduring values that can be applied not just in the context of this specific instance in this specific program, but actually respect, compassion, service, a mode of encountering others, communities, or problems that may be different from your own is an animating principle that this program would contend is applicable to today's problems, to context globally, context locally, to issues, to people, to personal relationships. So it's those underlying qualities that we think have an enduring rationale and an enduring reason for being active and implemented in service of today's problems. So what the fellows will be doing in winter and spring is going deeper into the thinking and learning there, and then looking for a problem that they can apply these ideas to and to create a program of their own. That's foreshadowing what's ahead for winter and spring for those of you who are new. I want to highlight one other quality that I think is also evidenced in one of the later Peace Corps spots. This is a short one. I remember this from my own childhood, as a matter of fact. And it's this.
You get into the Peace Corps. Here's your first test. If you think the glass is half empty, forget it. If you think it's half full, you might be the kind of person we're looking for. It all depends on how you look at things.
Isn't that great? Simple spot, done by the Ad Council, glass half full, glass half empty. The idea of optimism and hope and possibility for change. Talking to those at all ages, but particularly young people, who had a sense of purpose, a sense of idealism, a belief that you could make change in the world. A particularly seemingly vital component for the recruitment you're training, right? Let me play another spot, if you don't mind. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Graduate? Okay. There's, you want to describe the famous plastic scene of The Graduate, the cocktail party that Dustin Hoffman. Yeah, do you remember it?
Right in the beginning, right?
Yeah. Well, we'll play it. You can fill in, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. Here we go. So this is a longer spot, and I want to actually highlight something here. The one you just saw on Glass Half Full, and this spot come. This one in particular, this is, it's a spoof off a film that was released, I believe, in 1970. So this is now a few years later. If you think about the transformation that was taking place in American society between, say, 1961 and 1971, particularly the role that young people were playing, you get Kennedy assassination, you get Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, you get the escalation of the Vietnam War, you got civil rights in the mid-60s, you've got Kent State in the early 70s, and lots of churn in our cultural, political, and social life. And the messaging changes slightly as a result. It's an exact rip-off of the film.
Remember it. One word. Laugh. There's time enough to start a good career. First find out something about life. If you don't, you may never learn that money isn't the only thing in it.
What comments do you have about these last two spots? What's the underlying messaging? Yeah.
You know, I have to comment because I was a graduate at college in 1969, and the world had changed so much. When I graduated from high school in 1965, I was a Catholic schoolgirl in Ohio, Catholic high school. The Peace Corps was a no-brainer. It was so the idea of pitching it never occurred to me it had to be pitched, so this is really very informative. But by the time I had graduated from college in 1969 as a nurse, I knew that I needed to get some clinical experience, and the world had changed so much that the idea of joining the Peace Corps, I realized how much of a commitment it was and how challenging it was going to be, and it was very scary.
Yeah. What do you notice?
That related to, because of that movie, of course, any of us who lived there.
Yeah.
The sense that somebody is overwhelmed, and most of my peers were very overwhelmed and stressed out about what were they going to do after college, but for me as a nurse, I had a job anywhere.
Yeah. What other comments or observations do you have about this particular spot? Anybody here?
Well, I feel like you were saying, all the things that were going on during this time period, I feel like there was a lot of counterculture that was arising within this time period as well. And so I feel like the youth felt sort of disenfranchised with how the world was going at the time. And so with the glass half full ad and with this ad, it's kind of presenting two sides, kind of a cynical side and kind of like a hopeful side. And so really no one wants to be a cynic, right? Especially the youth in that day and age. So they want to be the optimistic people. And so I think the Peace Corps was saying, if you're one of these people, then like come harness that attitude and put it like within the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
So it tapped into, I think, the attitudes that a lot of these youth had in this time period, and that's how it probably became so successful.
Absolutely.
Well, don't you think the ad challenges commercial values in the United States?
Right, yeah.
That's the whole purpose of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And in so doing, it actually is positioning the Peace Corps with the values that were animating many of the young people in that generation at the time. I mean, what was brilliant about the film and brilliant about this spoof is you have a young college graduate at the graduation party. Parents have all sorts of advice about, the cocktails are flowing freely. This is clearly a home of privilege. This is a place where everybody's got advice about how you're going to make money in the world. Go to law school, plastics, that was the big, it'd be equivalent of saying today, go into tech or, go to Silicon Valley. And it ends with this notion that you point out, Danny, and that Bill, you underscore.
And I think it shows very, very graphically, as did the film, that Dustin Hoffman was bewildered.
Yes.
Bewildered by being launched into maturity without any boundaries.
Yeah. Yes. What am I going to do? Some of you may have felt some of those same thoughts as you look at life after graduation, whether that is a few years away or upon you now. So we wanted to share these because I think they are great examples of articulating some of the core values that Jamie was talking about. But I also think, Bill, to your other point, I mean, very, very sophisticated strategic work here. I mean, this is creative work that's operating at the highest levels of the field of advertising at that time. This is not just a government pamphlet at your local public library saying, hey, join the Peace Corps. This is about bringing the very, very smartest, most strategic minds. And I think as we saw with President Kennedy addressing from the Oval Office to camera on a public service announcement and the other one, I mean, this was a major, major initiative of the government. This was a huge priority.
No president had ever done that before.
Is that true?
Yes. You never saw a president recruiting for the military.
It's true. Yeah.
No president ever recruited for the foreign aid program.
Yeah.
This was unprecedented.
Yeah. So we think of the Peace Corps today as one of many options. It's more of maybe central to your concerns, but certainly it's just one of an endless sort of set of considerations, and it's clearly not the centerpiece of a presidential administration or an American notion of how it might actually leverage its place in the world for the advancement of its own issues and on behalf of peace. This was major.
And I think there's another theme here that, there's another ad which always struck me as a very important ad. It's the toughest job you'll ever love ad. It's very brief, it's 15 seconds. But I think the Peace Corps was also trying to make young people feel empowered, that they could be important, effective, make a contribution probably much earlier than they otherwise could in the United States. So I think empowerment was a big underlying subtle theme of the Peace Corps' outreach to its potential recruits.
Let's see, this is an example of one of those spots a little bit later. You know what? I pulled it wrong.
Among people who live close to the earth, life is simple, often uncertain.
I think, guys, I want to pull up an ad, and I pulled up a doc. Bear with me while we talk about this. While I search,
there's one other, just stepping back a little bit. When you think about, again, 1961, you think about Sarge as developing this program and the way he was selling it at the time. I mean, he's an incredible systems thinker and more advanced, I think, on this than
keep going.
Okay, more advanced than many folks. Systems thinking as a management tool and as an industrial thinking approach was only just emerging in in the early 1960s, and it was done in industrial engineering, and it was sort of so the thought was, well, there are all these complex systems out there in the world, and we can engineer solutions to them if we have enough data and if we have enough analytics, and we can develop the solution, we can insert it, and we can engineer the system. Now, I mean, in later years, people began to realize, well, that kind of systems engineering doesn't really work with people, and so there emerged soft systems thinking. Sarge was way ahead of that. He knew that the problem of peace, he knew that inserting, having the problem of enmity and the Cold War and wanting to transform it to friendship and peace, and intervening in that, you had to intervene as a person with people, because it was entirely a soft issue. It's not really soft. It was a human issue, and you have to do it by taking specific consideration of the people and the decisions they're making, the threats they feel, the hopes they have, and the commitments they make. And so everything he did positioned people to sort of enter this problem and make a difference in it. Volunteers were only one, and we're going to get to a couple others, but he had to do it with Congress, he had to do it with national leaders, he had to do it with the American people and with the people on the ground, and he had the kind of skills to sort of think how and then people like Bill, who could develop the practical nuts and bolts of a program to make this happen, how can we really intervene in the flow of history as people to change how people think about others? And that kind of was an extraordinarily sophisticated endeavor that we're only just figuring out how to do now.
Here is an example of the toughest job campaign, just so you have a sense of it. This may be something you have encountered along the way, because it was a pretty legendary campaign.
A handshake, a commitment to help each other. It's been the language of the Peace Corps for 20 years, and it says good things happen when we work together. From this village well to 1,000 projects all over the world, Peace Corps volunteers are building lasting friendships, and that means a better future for us all.
I've gotten a lot more than water out of this well. I've made hundreds of friends for America.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
That was their campaign, the toughest job you'll ever love. And they ran that campaign for a long time. This is a spot that, based on even the voiceover, it's sort of a around 1980 and early 80s spot. So we're 20 years into it by that point. But they ran that campaign in much of the 70s and 80s, and still is an enduring tagline for the Peace Corps in at least its popular zeitgeist. So we talked a little bit about how you're going to appeal to volunteers potentially, using sophisticated strategies and messages that speak right to the interests of a particular generation and also the core values you're trying to establish. How do you get countries, foreign leaders, others, to accept American volunteers into their nation? What do? You have a place for them.
Well, I think first you have to ensure that there's no political aspect to these volunteers. So they're not part of the United States government. They're not trying to have some foreign influence within their country. So like, Sarge went on that that month where he went to 9 different countries, and like I think, and there was like great controversy during that time. But I think he has to ensure to those leaders that like there is no way that these volunteers are not coming here to influence politically like what the American government wants. And if he's able to convince them of that, I think almost anybody would want help, especially in developing nations. They would want to receive help in like from anybody as much as they can get.
But they are part of the government, right? I mean, they are part of the State Department. They're being paid. I mean, Sergeant Shriver is part of the government. He's the brother-in-law of the President of the United States.
So I hate to play the cynic in a very idealistic setting, but I would also imagine that if you're on the other end, there's some thought of the more partnership I have with America, the more American students I have here, the more likely it is I get more foreign aid, or I get foreign aid, or, you know, I mean, there's all of these different international programs we're working with, and even though we talk about the Peace Corps, I think, honestly, as an idealistic separate thrust, it's still part of a larger thrust, and it does have to think about the influence those all would have on its reception.
It's a great point. It's a great point. I mean, if you are leader of a country acting in, you know, the self-interest of that nation, you're looking for things that can create all sorts of advantages. And the Peace Corps may offer multiple advantages beyond just the direct service and effectiveness that one Peace Corps volunteer can provide. Even if you privately think that, you know, individual Americans can't accomplish a hell of a whole lot in your country. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to ask, how much of a focus or how realistic is it to also have it be part of the mission to give like the local community the tools they might not have for some reason or another to like, you know, not need a volunteer afterwards? Because they are there to fill a gap and to form a certain role. Well, I assume that, you know, if it's possible that you also want them to be able to do it themselves afterwards.
Right.
So how much of a focus is there on that, and how realistic is that?
And I think that is one of the questions that undoubtedly surface in some of these meetings. What would be your response to that?
Well, the questions did come up. I mean, there were challenges back to Sarge about, there were a couple of the country leaders said in his report that we haven't had a very good experience with foreign aid. We haven't had a very good, and so how do we know that this is going to be, how do we know that this is going to be any different? And then Sarge, we don't know what he responded, but in his inimitable way, he would have said, we're here to serve you. We're here to pay attention to your needs. We're here to make friends. We're not part of ICA.
But to your point, Paula, in our first session, we heard Kirby Jones talk a lot about his service in the Dominican Republic. And as a specific example, you know, their approach was to ask what the community needed. Community surfaced a concern. It actually was an interesting first project by an American myopic way of thinking. They wanted street signs and house numbers for a neighborhood that was not on the grid. It was not even on maps of Santo Domingo. And Kirby tells the story of, you know, helping arrange that, and certainly there's no question that being an American Peace Corps volunteer held sway when they went down to, you know, City Hall and asked for official government. But that a lot of the work, I think, was designed really to, he didn't do that for them. He didn't negotiate the deal. The residents there were the ones that ultimately forced it through. So I think that part of the question that you asked is about sustainability. And it's also about, is there some sort of, you know, save your role, then you exit the scene, or is there a capacity building role, right? That strengthens the communities long after an individual Peace Corps volunteer or the program as a whole is there. And my sense is that capacity building was part of this, right?
I think that you have to understand that hand in glove with the very high-level contacts that Sarge had with the leaders of the 9 countries that he visited, he had been preceded by program explorers. For example, in Nigeria, there had been a report the Ashby Commission report, which identified tremendous needs for school teachers in Nigeria that Nigerians were not qualified to meet. So the proposed program in Nigeria was essentially a school teacher program. In Tanganyika, now Tanzania, farm-to-market roads were critical, and that out of that developed the surveyor program. India, which was not a significant recipient of economic aid and which received no military aid whatsoever, what did India want? It wanted rural development. It wanted, the first program in India was, believe it or not, poultry raising. So while this high-level approach was going on at that level, at the same time, the groundwork had been laid for programs that really were designed to try to meet the actual on-the-ground needs of these countries, that were not abstract programs.
Yeah. And take us into the history of this trip that Akash alluded to. How, you know, how did it come about? How did Sarge even get meetings with the important heads of state who were going to be critical in approving this program?
We identified the countries that we would want to go to, and we sought invitations.
And
we didn't always get invitations.
On what basis did you select the countries?
We selected the countries, first of all, for regional dispersal. We wanted a representative group of countries in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, and in the Far East. We also wanted countries, if we could persuade them, that were not necessarily members of CETO or CENTO, countries that were hopefully non-aligned. And we were successful in that with India and Indonesia, and with certain African countries.
Non-aligned in the context of the Cold War, certainly, just for those who may not be as familiar with that, yeah.
And
with
then,
either the Soviet Union
the
or
program side of it was extremely important. You know, one had to be able to talk, not only at the high level of discourse that you've been alluding to, but at the practical level. This is what you may need. This is what we can provide for your needs.
Yeah. All of this was going on contemporaneously. We'll come to the congressional piece and end with that, but you're making an appeal on Capitol Hill. You're beginning building out a program and recruiting volunteers, and at the same time you're recruiting countries.
Right.
I mean, there's high risk if any one of these things.
There's very high risk, and
the thing doesn't happen.
And you know, the process of signing up the country, so to speak, entailed the negotiation of executive agreements with each of these countries, and they were carefully and painstakingly drafted to differentiate themselves from the other kinds of agreements that the United States had for military assistance or economic assistance. No privileges and immunities, no PX privileges, no commissary privileges.
PX privileges, meaning?
Post-exchange. You know, when military personnel have access to supermarkets that are called post-exchanges, where you can buy all kinds of United States things at very, very highly subsidized prices. Yeah. None of that was to be available to volunteers. Volunteers were to have only the capability of, so to speak, of living off the land.
So each one of these was negotiated individually?
Each one of these was negotiated individually, and it was a time-consuming process.
What were the biggest barriers that Shriver and the program faced in trying to convince countries to welcome Peace Corps volunteers in?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that with any of the 9 we had such difficulties. We did have, and I'm sorry you left this out of the syllabus, but Sarge and I were commissioned to go to Guinea in June of 1961. Guinea was a French-speaking country in Africa, which was the only African country that voted no to de Gaulle's referendum on alignment with metropolitan France. And Guinea was, the president of Guinea was a very, very significant African leader, Sékou Touré, who probably was a communist. But we went to Guinea to persuade him to accept Peace Corps volunteers because it was a country that was extremely competitive between the United States and Russia. And while initially Touré was very skeptical, and while it took several years, in 1963, actually, Peace Corps volunteers did go to Guinea.
And whether it was to him or to the others, what was the central pitch?
The central pitch was, you need some help, we can help you. This is not an infiltration program. This is not a propaganda program. This is not a diplomatical program. You know, one of the interesting things about the trip to Guinea is our first day was spent talking to Touré in his office. The second day, he took us way out into the bush. He took us out to an extremely remote village where, in the course of our day there, they roasted a lamb on a spit. And we sat around with our fingers eating pieces of lamb for our midday meal. He was making a point.
That this is
the way it's going to be.
Life. Yes.
Yeah, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, Patrick.
I was actually wondering, going off of your last comment, if we could discuss a little bit about the Soviet response to the Peace Corps. We haven't heard anything about them either combating it or having their own program or saying bad things about the Peace Corps.
If we get in the third session to talk, in the last session actually, to talk about some of the elements of the Peace Corps Act, you'll see that in the Peace Corps Act was a waiver of all of the congressional restrictions on providing aid to Soviet and aligned countries. And we actually did get a request from Czechoslovakia. And it was very, very much in the early thinking of the Peace Corps that we would try to go to Iron Curtain countries. And when we actually responded to the request from Czechoslovakia, it vanished.
I want to pick up on that with two. In the documents that, not that we shared here today, but in documents that we uploaded online, there is a piece from the New York Times, a dateline March 15th, 1961, London. Moscow Radio said today that President Kennedy's Peace Corps was, quote, doomed to failure. An English language commentary beamed to North America and heard here said the idea behind the plan was to use youth as a pawn in the hands of the political strategists in Washington, pursue goals that are anything but selfless. That's a direct quote. The Moscow Radio has previously referred to the Peace Corps only obliquely in quoting United States press reaction. The idea of sending young volunteers to countries badly needing skilled workers was, quote, meritorious, it said today, but it charged that, quote, United States monopolies were trying to take over newly independent nations from colonizers. So that's one. You also have in a statement that Sarge makes in Chicago on May 17, 1961, coming back from his trip, enumerating different points, and that's also in one of the documents that we shared with you, the statement of Robert Sargent Shriver, Jr., Director of the Peace Corps. If you go to the second page of that document, you will see point 3. Third, the Peace Corps must expect attacks from communist propagandists or even from ill-informed nationalists. In one country, for example, a pro-communist newspaper demanded during our visit that the government, quote, get Mr. Shriver and his Peace Corps guerrillas out of the country. So deep skepticism there. On the other side, this is an item from March 23rd, 1961 from UPI, Dateline, Washington. Representative John J. Rhodes, an Arizona Republican, said today President Kennedy's Peace Corps presented a, quote, made-to-order opportunity for communist infiltrators. It is a made-to-order situation for left-wing extremists, he said of the organization. And I cannot imagine the hardcore of the communist organization failing to take advantage of the opportunity to make use of this. So you have, in both cases, fear within, in the Cold War politics of the day, fear on the part of the Soviet bloc, and fear on the part of Americans that this would be used as a vehicle and thereby a proxy in this larger global power game.
Was there ever a Soviet response or a similar program, I guess I should ask?
No, they never did, actually. It's an oddity. You would have thought they would have, but they never did. And the speculation always was that they were afraid of defection. That they were afraid that if lots of young people went overseas to non-aligned countries and saw something of the life there and the freedom there, they would defect. They would not go back to Russia. And of course, that was always a concern with, for example, Russian artists. You know, when Shostakovich came to the United States to work with Bernstein on one of the premieres of the Shostakovich Symphony, he was constantly shadowed. My wife, who's the archivist of the Philharmonic, has pictures of Bernstein and Shostakovich, and you can see that behind Shostakovich in every picture are two Russian
minders, basically.
Minders is not the word. So, you know, and actually, when Bernstein went to Moscow on tour in the 50s, the Soviets were extremely upset because who came to the concert? Shostakovich came to the concert, and oh, I'm having a senior moment. The author of the great Russian freedom novel. Come on, Steve, help me.
Solzhenitsyn?
No, not Solzhenitsyn, but exact contemporary of Solzhenitsyn. Dr. Zhivago, the author of Dr. Zhivago, come backstage.
Yeah.
And there are wonderful pictures of Bernstein and Shostakovich and Boris Pasternak drinking and smoking cigars and having a good time, and these very anxious faces in the background. And I'd like to highlight, if I may, something else from Sargent's speech, because it's a very interesting statement. If you look at 7, America's greatest challenge is to mobilize our national will behind a major international effort to advance the cause of peace and freedom. In wartime, we were able to harness the full energy of our people to achieve victory. We must do the same thing in the fight for, now, here's the crucial word, this is in the middle of the Cold War, in the fight for peace. There is a war on, but he's not referring to the Cold War, a war against ignorance, poverty, disease, and all forms of oppression. The communists are offering a totalitarian solution. We must demonstrate and help the developing peoples of the world to show that democratic methods are ultimately the most successful way to solve their problems. This is an extraordinary departure from the rhetoric of the Cold War.
And yet, if you look back to the document that says Peace Corps volunteer personnel policies, the bottom of page 3, we have the Peace Corps oath.
Right.
Would you read that too? And
yes, but I would like to make it clear that this was imposed upon us by Congress.
Oh, okay, okay.
This was not our proposal.
There's a perfect segue into the congressional piece.
There was nothing in the Peace Corps Act as it was sent up by the executive branch that contained this or anything like it.
Yeah.
Do I have to read it?
Yes.
Yes, she has a question.
Yes, that bottom of the page. Yes, yes, Bella.
Kind of relates to that. I was going to say that there's like an emphasis of like selection on merit, saying that there doesn't have to be like a political test, but there's also like a language regarding paranoia about like extreme radicals and communists infiltrating it.
Yeah.
So let's say that you have like an uncle that might have been like part of an organization, or at any point you might have had some involvement with them, immediately bar you.
Look, the whole thing is an embarrassment. But this you have to understand is in the age of the security oaths. You know, wonderful as he was, Harry Truman buckled in to the McCarthyists, and the United States imposed an internal security program. This oath is modeled after 3 oaths. It's modeled after the constitutional oath. It's modeled after the oath that all United States government employees take, and it's modeled after the security oath that you had to take to get a security clearance. It's an amalgam which reflects, in a very interesting way, various strands of America: the devotion to the Constitution, the commitment to public service, and anti-communism.
Yeah, and I one of the things that strikes me about the oath.
I think it's been repealed, incidentally.
Has it been?
Yeah, I think so.
Is it's also another element, as I think repugnant as it was to you, and I'm sure to Shriver, of, and all of this in some respects, this idea of practical idealism, is it not? Service of the larger objective of peace and transforming a way of thinking and being in the world, and yet understanding what needed to happen to actually allow that promise to take root. Is that fair to say?
You see this today. There has always been this incredible, what I would call, you might disagree, this know-nothing strand in American politics. And so you see it today. You may not agree with this, but you just see it today in congressional attitudes toward Planned Parenthood, congressional attitudes toward multilateral trade agreements, and congressional attitudes to one kind of tax reform as opposed to another kind of tax reform. The politics today is actually no different than the politics that's reflected in this oath. You have to cope with that. You have to accept it. You have to learn how to get your institution to survive in that context if you believe in what you're trying to do.
All right, so let's go deep into Congress. The third constituent here, and are there any questions about anything that was said before we jump into there? To recall where we stood at the end of last session, the President ultimately signs off on the Peace Corps as an autonomous entity within the State Department, expends political capital to do that, and sends the message in no uncertain terms to Shriver, fine, I gave you your way on this. Shriver wanted that degree of autonomy, but you're on your own when it comes to Congress. So as you look down Pennsylvania Avenue and look at getting Congress on board with this, what are you facing? What's the complexion of Congress in 1961?
Well, I need to start with a proposition that you may all disbelieve, but it's very important to love legislators. It's not easy, but you have to love legislators. You know, I'm still very active, for example, with the New York State Legislature, which is not exactly an uncorrupt body, and I get along with them extremely well, and they get along with me extremely well because they know that I respect them for having gotten elected, something that I probably could never do, and for having to make hundreds of decisions in the course of a session on the basis of inadequate information, on the basis of staff advice, on the basis of other sources of information. The job of a legislator is extremely difficult. One of the characteristics of the Kennedy-Johnson administration was that you had two senators. They understood what it was like to run for office. Kennedy had been a congressman as well as a senator. They understood the politics of the House. Johnson was a protege of Sam Rayburn, the Speaker. They understood the politics of the Senate. Johnson once asked me at the height of the war against poverty crisis over the Child Development Group of Mississippi, he asked me to go talk to John Stennis and go talk to McClellan of Arkansas because he knew that I liked them, that they liked me, that I had respect for their smarts. And we worked out a compromise. I had that theme in the last session, you know. Without compromise, there is no progress. So a very important element of this was a almost nonpartisan, certainly bipartisan approach. We had tremendous support from Republicans as well as Democrats. I had a meeting yesterday when I was challenged on it. I began ticking off the names of important Republicans who supported us. Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, Bolton of Ohio, even Burke Hickenlooper of Iowa, with whom I told the story about the debate between Humphrey and me and Hickenlooper about how many volunteers would be assigned to the United Nations international organizations. Well, Burke ultimately voted for the Peace Corps. You know, the only significant congressman I know of who never voted for the Peace Corps was Jerry Ford, of all people.
Really?
Yep.
Why?
I don't know. Inexplicable.
Never voted for the Peace Corps.
Never voted.
I guess along with that, why would someone not want to vote for the Peace Corps in Congress?
Well,
yeah, what was the source of the
certain
opposition?
people thought it was a silly waste of money.
Okay.
H.R. Gross of Ohio, who was a very, very important figure because he was one, you know, each party designates in the House people always to be on the floor to make sure that nothing slips by. So Gross is one of the Republican designees who always occupied the floor. He was smart, he was difficult, terrible troublemaker. And he also believed that this was a waste of money. Silly idea, waste of money. One of the things that we did, which was very shrewd, we notified every senator's and every congressman's office whenever a Peace Corps volunteer from their district was accepted into the Peace Corps, told them their country of service, told them how to reach them, made sure that the local newspapers carried those stories. So we're building a Peace Corps constituency to support our supporters in the House and the Senate. Very important. I can't imagine why presidents since our time don't do that, but they do not.
And you also spent a ton of time on Capitol Hill in face-to-face meetings. You were not
only a
outsourcing
ton of time on Capitol Hill in face-to-face meetings, but I'm sitting in on markup. I'm sitting, this is at a time, markup now is a fairly public thing, unfortunately. But back in my day, markup in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, markup in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, markup in the Appropriations Subcommittees took place behind closed doors. I was invited in. I sat there as they debated whether to approve or not approve as the amendments were offered. I was often asked to draft an amendment that I really disagreed with, but it had a majority. You know, there's another one of my anecdotes. You want to bear with my anecdotes? Sure. Many years later, I was invited to a reception at the UN, and I walked in. There was the then Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, and a congressman from Pennsylvania, Wiley. And I walked over and said hello to them, and Wiley was hectoring Rogers about something. I can't imagine anymore what. But one of the things he said, now you take Josephson here. He often disagreed with us. But in the long run, when we wanted something, he did it the way we wanted. And later, he said to me as we were walking away from Rogers, he said, you know that, Bill Rogers? You know what John Stennis once said about Bill Rogers? And I said, no. He said, that Bill Rogers, he's as slick as a shithouse rat. So that's a contrast.
Yeah.
Between me and a Secretary of State.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me that in both cases, Congress and in working with heads of state, that the underlying ideas that Shriver was trying to inculcate among the Peace Corps volunteers were ideas that he was himself practicing and having his staffers practice. Is that a fair characterization as well?
Yeah, that's a very fair characterization.
So what was the thing that made Shriver particularly compelling in those interpersonal relationships as you sort of look back on the history of it?
Well, as I understand the history of it, he was particularly gifted at putting himself in the place of the person he was talking to. I don't, my sense is that he didn't come in with a pitch that with the idea being that I'm going to open up the top of your head and pour in what I know and then close it back up. Yeah. That he was much more interested in, he'd understood from beforehand in judging where you were coming from, what your concerns were, tapping into your own idealism. I mean, one of the things that Bill Moyer says was that he would always say, if you were 25 years old again, this is exactly the program you'd be in. Yeah. You care about this country, you care about peace, and you know you could have done this. Yeah. And you know, that kind of thing is what he did.
Now, you did face significant opposition on the Senate's side of the legislature rather, in the form of Senator Fulbright.
That's correct.
Why? What was going on?
Well, first of all, Bill Fulbright was a very, very, very difficult guy. Very smart, a Rhodes Scholar from Arkansas, an ostensible segregationist, who had created a program that you're all familiar with. It bears his name, the Fulbright Scholars. And there was some quirk in Fulbright's personality that apparently required him to think that the Peace Corps would somehow be competitive with the Fulbright program. So the administration's request for a Peace Corps authorization was $40 million. Fulbright announced that he was in favor of cutting the authorization. Remember, there's a two-step process, authorization and then appropriation, and appropriation is always less than the authorization. He was in favor of cutting the Peace Corps authorization to $10 million. 25% cut. It would have put us out of business. His position was not readily fathomable.
How long did he tie things up?
Well, we had the votes, so the answer to that is not very long.
But he was a thorn in your side throughout much of the summer of 1961.
He was a thorn in our side into 1963.
But in terms of actually passing the Peace Corps Act that
Yes.
summer, but he stayed on the case.
He stayed on the
thereafter.
case,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So ultimately, what was it that enabled? I know you tried to work on Fulbright.
Well, I was very successful finally.
And how?
Oh, this is a later story, but you know, in the context of congressional dissatisfaction with foreign aid and in the context of the Cold War, the House and the Senate were constantly passing riders, particularly on appropriation bills, that would restrict the provision of aid in this way or that way or in some other way. And these were often sloppily drafted so that the Peace Corps was affected by these restrictions, even though they may not have been intended. So, you know, I drafted a provision to go into the Peace Corps Act, which essentially said that the only restrictions that could affect the Peace Corps are restrictions that specifically refer to it. And Moyers and I lobbied, this is in '63, we lobbied the Senate, and we got a significant bunch of senators, Republicans, Javits and Keating, for example, from New York, and Democrats, conservatives, as well as liberals, to support this amendment. The amendment gets introduced. Wayne Morris asks for a live quorum. You understand, a live quorum is a device to get senators to the floor, but to have very, very slow call of the quorum. The clerk will start out and say the name of a senator who begins with A. In those days, it was Aiken. And then there would be this long pause before he got to the B. And in that pause, I walked into the Senate caucus room, and there was Fulbright and McGovern, and our two sponsors, Javits and Jennings Randolph of West Virginia, a critical sponsor because he was chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And Fulbright wanted the Fulbright program included in this exception from restrictions. And McGovern, senator from South Dakota, wanted the Food for Peace program excluded from these restrictions. So we worked it out so that this amendment, which had started out as a Peace Corps amendment, became an amendment that covered all of these non-military person-to-person humanitarian programs, humanitarian aid to refugees, and it passed by something like 63 to 20.
Wow. What questions do you have about the congressional piece this week? What lessons do you take from that time period? I mean, it wasn't assured that you would get overwhelming support in either chamber. And you have big risks here because you have volunteers who have been recruited, being trained, they're ready to be deployed.
And are overseas.
Yep. And then you also have you know, the expectations of the countries that you've now just convinced to have a program at scale, and if Congress doesn't sign off, this thing becomes...
And that's why Fulbright's opposition was so important and difficult to understand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask, like, what allies do you have in terms of like civil society or just other groups of people that weren't necessarily political activists backing you up to get these passed? Did you have a lot of support again from like different organizations, or was it mostly a tough battle between you and Congress?
Well, it was not only a person-to-person effort with each congressman and senator, but you know, as we would walk through the aisles, through the office buildings, and Sarge would see an office. Oh, I haven't met him before. We would simply walk in. But other things we did, for example, was to get editorials in the hometown newspapers of these congressmen and senators. We did a great deal to get governors who were very close to the families that were sending Peace Corps volunteers into the Peace Corps to lobby their congressional delegations to support the Peace Corps. So constituent building was an extremely important part of the congressional effort. The congressional effort went on at several levels. The
Jamie,
one level we didn't have was the president.
It's true. Jamie, let's close by having you relate this to the experience of the Shriver Fellows, both those who will come up in the upcoming quarter, but especially the experience of last year's Fellows. What are the parallels between the experiences in both recruiting volunteers, selling into the host entities, and getting institutional approval in the form of Congress that last year's Fellows encountered?
Well, we should probably talk to Brittany about that. But it seems to me the parallels are pretty direct. I mean, all the way from the beginning, the idea of having a problem, youth and violence, and justice to try to solve one that hasn't been solved, grappling with how Shriver's method can then be used to formulate, to develop a contemporary formula for practical idealism, and then once that's there, to figure out where's it going to live. I mean, is it going to live in the IOP? Is it going to live somewhere else? Is it going to affiliate with SSPI? Is it going to be an independent nonprofit? And then once it's there, and the model is as the Chicago Peace Corps, to engage other people from the community and the college to work for peace and work for youth, and through restorative justice and tutoring and other kinds of things to get folks to volunteer. How do you recruit that? How do you sell that? How do you market that? All the stages that we've traced in this case study have, in my view, been, the questions that come up have been addressed by or faced by the current Shriver Fellows. Brittany, would you say that's right, or am I?
Yeah, that's fair. I also think I'd be better equipped to answer that question in like 6 months, considering that we've only been operating for about 4 months.
Yeah.
And also we're still recruiting volunteers if everyone wants to volunteer to school and learn what restorative justice is, just putting that out there.
And you're meeting on Thursday nights, correct?
Yeah, we meet on Thursday nights in the basement of the IOP at 6 p.m.
So that's an opportunity to learn about the project that resulted from last year's Shriver Fellows. Also an opportunity to connect with some past Shriver Fellows. I also want to put on the table for you to watch for Tuesday evening, November 24th, here in the living room. We will have an information session led by many of last year's Shriver Fellows. I talked with Ivan and Graceland, and they were going to organize the crew to answer any questions and talk about the fellowship program for the upcoming quarters for those of you who are interested in applying. So that'll be on the evening of Tuesday, November 24th. We'll have food. It'll be fairly short, but hopefully helpful to you. If anyone else has questions about the application process, don't hesitate to see any of us as well in the meantime. I should end by saying 2 quick things. Ultimately, the Peace Corps Act was passed in late August of 1961, September of 1961, which put the final bow on top of the legislative and governmental piece of this story. Next week, we will look at a couple of different things. One of the things we're going to look at, and I'm telegraphing to you, Bill, because we haven't had a chance to debrief, is just what's happened to the Peace Corps between then and now over time. What are the enduring lessons of the Peace Corps experience as manifest by Sergeant Shriver's vision that we might be able to apply to other problems today? And how do we want to think about that? So we're going to try and move forward the lessons of the past few weeks into some living questions, and we'll also clean up some loose ends and delve into any questions that you guys have for next week. So we welcome you back next week at noon. Let me end by just highlighting one quote from the address that Shriver gave on May 17, 1961. He says, "I'm convinced that if in the future our country is to meet the unparalleled opportunity to win friends and advance the cause of peace and freedom, thousands of additional Americans will have to step forward and say, 'I will serve.' True then and true now, and we're happy to have you with us and hope that you'll take those words to heart." Thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks a lot.